through some ideas on the process and the criteria to make priorities regarding the national implementation plans. As indicated, these are only initial considerations. You have the guidance for developing national implementation plans under the Stockholm Convention, and in particular, phase 3 relates to priority assessment and objectives setting. The main things that the guidance mentions related to objectives go into country-specific criteria, which needs always to be taken into consideration first, because even you are parties to the Stockholm Convention, specific criteria regarding to your national situations for making priorities in health and environmental issues because of the TOPS impacts is extremely necessary. The other thing it is very necessary within this priority setting is to really understand the available information you have had and you have collected in the phase of inventories. Data gaps or other available information, but might also be a very interesting point regarding prioritization. It can go into two directions. If you have a gap, you might decide to really go and find the information because that can make a difference, or you just might decide that at this moment the gap is something you can live with and continue working with the other things you have already inventorized. Undertaking NIPS, it's not only a development phase, but also a review and an update. So you always need to go and see the effectiveness of the previous measures you have been undertaking. Objectives, it means that objectives can be short, medium, or long term, and that's also something that priorities, where priorities start playing in this game. So what are the things that are needed? First, is the consider. Oops, it's not working. I need it. Sorry. Very sorry for that technical issue. So regarding priorities and the process, one important thing to always consider is the life cycle of the chemicals under consideration. In this presentation, we're going to address chemicals listed in Annex A and B. For chemicals listed in Annex C, the process should be the same, but you also have a methodology as part of the inventory guidance. So we are going to address mainly Annex A and Annex B chemicals. In this sense, talking about the life cycle and the elements you have to consider, you have to have a look at your national legislation, how things have been regulated, if you have already banned or restricted production and use of these chemicals, or if you need to do it. The same for export and import, but mainly the most important part for these chemicals is how you will manage stocks, wastes, and contaminated sites. Besides, of course, the identification of those products or articles that are being used by your country. How can you assess that? By your national implementation plans. In here you have 3 of the guidance that are available for doing that. It's actually 3 themes, but it's more than 3 guidance. And it relates to the assessment of pesticides, to the inventories of the PFOS and PBDEs, but also which can be considered best available techniques or best environmental practices. And the guidance for that is also available in the website. In considering how to make plans and how to make priorities, monitoring considerations should be also addressed. And for that, how your customs are working, are there available measures already, or do you have to set in place more things? Analytical control, is that feasible in your country? Do you have any labeling that might be considered? In the case of labeling, you can see that there is a question mark there, because as you know, labeling is not mandatory for Stockholm Convention, but it is something that parties have started to think about. In particular, when HBCD was listed last year in May, some considerations to labeling have been made. Still, how to do it or what to target has not been defined, but labeling is something that might also be of interest when you are assessing future plans and making priorities. So to see how the issue of priorities can be done in the process, first you need to understand what your key problems are. Here in this slide and the next one, it's only going to address in very general terms potential problems that can be identified regarding the different chemicals listed in Annex A or B. For example, if you're talking about alpha and beta HCH, you know that they are byproducts of lindane, so they have not been produced with a purpose. Therefore, the main issues to consider are stockpiles, contaminated sites if you have produced within your border lindane. If you have produced lindane in your border, at this stage, the production should be banned because no longer production of lindane is allowed if you are a party to the Stockholm Convention. Therefore, the production ban needs to be considered as well. If you don't have legislation in this place, sometimes it is important as a preventive measure to always include it. Regarding the other pesticides, chlordecone, pentachlorobenzene, lindane, and endosulfan, they have been listed in different ways. For example, for chlordecone, there is no exemption for use or production. So for chlordecone, any enforcement, ban, or restriction should be strong. But you might have stockpiles. You might have also contaminated sites, or in the case of lindane or endosulfan, that they have exemptions, and that might be a little more complicated. In the case of lindane, you know that next year by August 2015, the exemption might expire. So lindane is again to be considered if it is still necessary, and that might be a priority for a country that might have certain health considerations, but mainly stockpiles. In regarding to endosulfan, the exemption is still available. There are many exemptions regarding the crop or the pest you are using, but what you have to see and consider is the register for exemptions, and that, according to the convention, is a priority, so that parties can really evaluate the continued need for these chemicals. Regarding the industrial chemicals, the situation is a little more complicated. At this moment, we have PFOS, the brominated ones, hexabromodiphenyl, and HBCD. HBCD has not yet entered into force, but will very soon, so it is considered here, not identified as a issue to be considered, but just for you to remember that it's coming very soon. In relation to HBCD, parties that don't want to be considered part of the Stockholm Convention regarding HBCD still have some time to decide to opt out, and that can be something, a priority for some of you. In the case of hexabromodiphenyl, it seems that it has no longer been produced or used worldwide, so stockpiles might be the only thing to have a look at. In the case of all of them, legislation, either by banning or restricting them, enforcement things, stockpiles, contaminated sites, and articles in use that are becoming waste, and waste from articles and from products is something very important to have a look at and to have as part of your assessment and inventory. In the case of the commercial brominated flame retardants that have been listed, the recycling of articles is still allowed until 2030. And in this case, also it is important to consider the recycling sector, not as a whole, because recycling might include, of electronic waste, for example, might include many, many other products besides those listed in the Stockholm Convention. But it is interesting to see how recycling of these articles is being undertaken under the national circumstances and what type of measures are needed. In the case of PFOS and related chemicals, they have been listed with many exceptions and with many acceptable purposes as well. So in this case, due consideration needs to be made. But for that, it is very important that you have already taken the picture of the situation regarding PFOS at national level so that you can make plans and priorities that are according to the situations. So Starting with the second part of the process, the first one was really to identify the problem that's being done with inventories. And then what we are suggesting as part of it for your consideration is a qualitative assessment. And in relation to this, you might need to identify not only the general source of information from the guidance we have indicated, but also the need of registering. You also need to consider if you are producing and exporting, if your country is producing and exporting any of these chemicals, well, you have to check if you have authorization, until when those authorizations are in place, and if you need to change that measure or not. For example, some countries in relation to endosulfan, they are still having authorization to the production of endosulfan for a long, long time. If they want to comply, they have to really check those measures. But also, because of how the Stockholm Convention works, it is important to analyze the export information and how you are dealing with the trade of these chemicals. If you are a user, which means probably that you are an importing country, then it is not the export information that you need, but it is the import information. You also need to consider if there are some illegal trade considerations to have a look at. If you are very close to countries that are producing these chemicals, if you are not close, but you have a previous indication that that illegal trade might be occurring, you also need to put in place certain measures to control these chemicals. For this, the communication with the industry, with customs, with users associations, it's extremely important. Therefore, the stakeholders you might be addressing for analyzing this information might be a little different, but the objective of this is the same, to really understand your country's situation regarding potential measures to be taken and how that can be seen or not as a priority. So we are addressing priorities, taking into consideration potential risk management measures. So the first thing to think about is what is the first line of defense. And for that, what you really need to consider is to avoid new POPs in the future in your country, either by not producing or not importing, and thinking about the use and how you want to phase out the use if that is what it is requested for that chemical. In that case, again, legislation is very important, but before putting in place any ban or restriction of the new POPs, you have to assess, are there alternatives? Are they feasible for our country? Is there any socio-economic impact that we have to consider? Do we need to put in place monitor considerations, import, production, use? So that's what a country might see as the first line, having in place legislation and the enforcement mechanism for it. The other thing is avoid the use of the new POPs in the future by the specific exemptions and acceptable purposes. So you go through them and you see, for example, endosulfan, we are using endosulfan for coffee for this pest. Are we still needing that? If not, well, then consider limiting the specific exemption within your borders. It's not only that you have not registered within the Stockholm Convention, but thinking on how to address that situation at national level. So you have in place certain restrictions or certain prohibitions that might allow you not to no longer import. But that's not only what it is needed. As I was saying before, you also need to notify if you are using those chemicals for the specific exemptions for acceptable purposes. The other thing it is important to assess is, do we have techniques or practices that might be important, and do we still need the exemptions? Second line is regarding the identification and the management of the existing new POPs in your country, and that can go into the direction of the products, the articles, or even the production of the chemicals themselves. In this case, identify the existing new POPs in your country through the inventory, notify the different types of articles that you might have for the continued use in your country to the Secretariat, manage the existing new POPs in your country, manage new stockpiles, waste, and contaminated sites. For this, these are the main things to consider, and therefore the main things to have in mind when you are thinking of priorities. If you have certain issues related to one chemical that has acceptable purposes or specific exemptions, but you have no management techniques, or you don't have any clue on how to do and manage your stockpiles, that might be a priority if you need to phase out them very quickly. But in some other cases, you need to put it into perspective and see your national situation. If you are talking about management of stockpiles of e-wastes, how are you going to address that sector? It is very important that you do that in an environmentally sound manner, but you also need to establish and put in place many other things. So maybe that's not immediate action you have to take, but it is more a medium size or medium type of measure. But these are just examples and ideas. It doesn't mean that all the countries might need to follow exactly the same patterns. It depends a lot on your inventories and your picture, and of course on your conditions. So what are the elements to consider just to really have some plans and priorities that are implementable? First is the risk from the releases of each new chemicals. And for that, you are talking, for example, about plastics, and you are not recycling them. So you have to assess the risk at your national level. Is it high? Is it medium? Is it low? And therefore, you just start categorizing with this qualitative approach at the beginning. Do you have the potential to reduce the risk using those measures? And again, high, medium, and low. Do you need resources for that? What is the potential size of the releases? And again, medium, high, and low. And that can give you an idea on where you are standing at the moment. Regarding the resources needed, it is also very important to see and have an estimate if you are needing technical assistance, if you are needing funding and financial agencies to help and support, if you can include that in your budget. And that can make a difference in how you establish your priorities, because in a way, you might decide that for you a priority is to have a follow-up project immediately or even within the National Implementation Plan development. If you need to go and talk to your Ministry of Economy to put some resources and financial resources into this chemicals management for the near future, it might take long. So you might need to start very quickly. Some other countries might have a different situation, and that might be easier to address. Another very important element to consider when you are making priorities is that if the measure is implementable under the conditions of the party. Do you have personnel with the expertise that it is needed? Do you have to hire external people? Do you need to have somebody working in a routinary basis with you in the ministry, with you in the agency that you are working for, or do you need to hire somebody to do that? Do you have capacity and the infrastructure needed? Do you have laboratories? Do you have equipment? Do you have facilities? That can make a whole difference in how you establish your priorities and how you will address your plans in the near future. The other thing to consider is if the measure is practical and enforceable for the party. I always give the same example when we are talking about practical and enforceable measures. As you know, PFOS is a water and oil repellent, and it has been widely used in carpets. So is it a practical measure to analyze all carpets in the country? Is it enforceable? And if that's so, what will be the measure you take. Are you going to suggest everybody to take out the carpets in your country because they contain PFOS? So there you see a measure, you need a measure that it is really practical, enforceable, implementable, and also assessing and putting there the potential resources that you might need. So what is the first suggestion? If you see the inventory guidance as it was developed, it has considerations regarding a tiered approach. So what we always indicate is that having an overview using the first tier that it's in the guidance explained, you'll have an initial idea. It is a qualitative assessment at the beginning that, of course, it can be improved and advanced, but maybe you are happy with the results because the results are really telling you where you are in. Therefore, use those results, that's the suggestion, and make priorities based on that result. And one of the planning and one of the priorities might be we need to follow up and go in depth with this inventory. It might be at this stage, we will keep on using the articles that have those chemicals, and we will assess in 5 years. That's also possible. But what it is important is that the data you have, it is enough to make a priority, but also to establish a roadmap for your country, the planning that you need to put in place for the implementation of the convention. If you are not satisfied and you have the resources to do so, then go to the next tier. That implies sending questionnaires, going and making some visits, and maybe also taking some samples and make them analyzed. The other suggestion in this process, of course, is to communicate this situation to the National Coordination Committee and assess the measure within a multi-stakeholder audience. Sometimes you just need to have some conclusions that are good for all of you. Therefore, your priority setting elements need to be assessed by the country itself. So it is not only the elements that we have been mentioning, so to know what the situation are, to see what the potential measures are, and to know if you have the resources that are needed, but also to assess the impact of the measure. Is there any risk reduction potential in the measure you are taking? Or the other way around, are you increasing the risk by the measure you are taking because you are doing nothing? Of course, the issue of resources, practicability, and enforceability will need to be put forward to your National Coordination Committee for them to assess the situation. You also need to consider that maybe the results you have from your inventories are not good enough or might have a lot of uncertainty. That also needs to be consideration in the process. Again, for repeating that in an early stage or for not taking care of it until 5 years, 6 years, or longer, depending on the figures you got. The other thing is you need agreement on the measures, and for that we are indicating again a qualitative approach, high, medium, or low, for you to have at least an initial idea of how to do things. Something very important for this is that you cannot go into making priority setting a very strict process unless you really have very, very good information or a huge amount of resources available. Therefore, you cannot be stricter than the data you have, and that's why the qualitative approach is being suggested. Once you have identified priorities, you have to also identify the measures that might be of high risk reduction, easy to identify, easy to manage, practicable, and enforceable. And there you have some criteria on how to do it. So a priority should be that can imply a very important risk reduction of the management of the chemical in its life cycle, that it is practical to implement, and that it is enforceable. That those should be the type of measures that are most efficient and have the highest priority. That's an indication as well. But there are also other measures that you still need to take on board that might not be high, they might be medium, or they might be low, but it might be low at this stage for action, for immediate action, but not for the medium-term action. So that's also something important to assess. The other potential measures of relevance that might be available. Implementation of the priority. You need to start working after you make your priorities and your plan. When you finish receiving resources from the GF, if you are an eligible country, or from your country, are you going to stop the implementation of the measures? Of course, you should not be doing that. So you need to get agreement. That could be legislation to endorse the plan and to validate it, resources from your government, resources from extra budgetary funding, or maybe some other technical expertise that you might be needing. Plan, implement also other priority measures, as I was saying before. Your priorities might be priorities in time, but might also be priorities in action. And that is something important to consider as well. And as part of the methodology for the inventory and for the needs themselves, and also for other things related to inventories of hazardous wastes or inventories of, development of national action plans for the Rotterdam Convention, it is very important to document your experience and indicate what things you have considered, what things you have discharged, and why. That can help a lot to follow the process and to understand if the measures were implementable, where were the external things that made things happen or that stop things from moving. Summary: the method, the process. Identify the big problems you have. The examples we gave here are general indications. You might have completely different things. A qualitative assessment for the relevance of those new POPs that might be contained in products and articles in your country. And remember here, what are you producing? Are you using? What things you have in use? The first line of defense that you might need. But also apply the priority setting process for selecting those measures that can be considered the most efficient one. Plan and implement accordingly, and that's your second line of defense. So for the time being, this is a very general presentation, as I told you at the beginning, with initial considerations, and we addressed a little not only the process for and the criteria to prioritize, but also elements to consider in your national implementation.